Welcome to an overview of the buy-to-let landscape presented to you by Roger Morris. So without further ado, I will hand you straight over to Roger.
Thank you, Natalie. We're going to go on a journey. This particular segment of your learning when it comes to specialist buy-to-let will be the overview of the buy-to-let landscape, and it's going to be done in two sections, hopefully of around about 30 minutes per section, which will allow you to be able to deal or do that learning during maybe your lunch break or when you've put down learning and investment and development to your own technical knowledge. For those that don't know me, I've been a landlord for over 30 years and I've met some incredibly gifted and knowledgeable individuals over that time. And I want to put that back into a structured learning webinar, which gives their reasons that they entered the buy-to-let market and why they're in the buy-to-let market today, as long as with my own shared experiences. So what I'd like you to do now is to sit back and come on a journey with me. And what we will do is this particular first part, the overview, is done in two sections. And then we will move on to complex and structured ownership of buy-to-let, which will deal with limited company and it will deal with personal ownership. We'll then move into houses of multiple occupation and MUFBs. And then lastly, we'll talk about buying properties below market value, renovation of properties purchased and refinanced within 6 months. We'll look at bridging finance. We'll look at holiday lets, short-term lets, serviced accommodation, and HMRC's approach to landlords declaring the properties for taxation and let to buy. So we're going to cover a lot over these series of 4 well-structured buy-to-lets, but they've been split into part 1 and part 2. So in this first of these presentations, I want to emphasize one point. Neither did myself, Natalie, this presentation or Chetwood Bank ever give tax advice. However, we do want to provide information on how tax is ultimately affected within the structure of ownership and how it can affect more aggressively ownership in personal names when it's high and top rate taxpayers, and how HMRC's rules apply to properties held in limited companies. We would always say to any buy-to-let landlord or mortgage advisor or yourself who wants tax advice to only ever speak to a tax advisor and never to an accountant or a mortgage advisor unless they have passed the necessary tax qualifications. Buy-to-let is all about your mindset. If you are a qualified mortgage advisor at this moment in time, and maybe you're doing buy-to-let or you're prolific in buy-to-let, have you thought about whether or not you need 2 absolute different mindsets when it comes to arranging finance for the purchase of a buy-to-let needs to be different to a residential. With a residential, you'll always get the clients the cheapest ultimate rate, the least monthly payment expenditure out of the family's household finances. But with a landlord, the rate should be one of the last things that you think about. You need to first decide the structure of ownership before you actually then select the rate. If your mindset is selecting it on rate first, and let's say the mortgage payment's £1,000 a month and the applicant's a high rate taxpayer, they're only going to be able to offset £200 of that contractual monthly payment. However, if they've done it in a limited company, they could offset 100%. This will make the difference between making a profit and making a loss. So that mindset becomes very important. And the best way, and the way that I explain it when I'm doing physical presentations, to explain your mindset is really the approach to driving a car. Now you might think, Rog, I know when I first did this with Natalie, she laughed. She said, come on then, how does driving a car have a mindset to advising with buy-to-let? Right, go with me on this. And just remember, this is an analogy to try and help explain the differences between the mindset of buying in personal names, buying a residential mortgage or buying a buy-to-let. So you're qualified to give advice on a residential mortgage, and let's say you're qualified to drive a car. If you were to get in the car today and go out to the shops, you'd automatically approach the driver's side from the right-hand side of the vehicle. You'd get in, put the seatbelt on, you'd do the safety checks, and off you'd go following the highway code without a second thought. Very similar to residential. You approach residential by ultimately getting the family the cheapest deal, and you kind of know straight away which lenders are offering the cheapest deals at the moment, and it's normally the big five. However, when it comes to buy-to-let, this is very different, and the best analogy I can give you is imagine you're now going abroad, you land in Malaga, you've hired a car, it's exactly the same car as what you have at home, but it's a hire car. You go to the terminal, you go to the registration desk, you get your keys, you know which bait's in, you walk to the car, it's the same colour car as you got at home. It's white. The car at home you got is white, the car you've hired is white. You walk up to the vehicle, you press the fob because you know the vehicle key set, the boot opens, it's so familiar to you. You put your bags in, this feels identical, and you walk round to the driver's side and the right hand side and you jump in and you laugh. It's not the same. Yes, it's the same vehicle made by the same company in the same colour. However, the steering wheel's on the left hand side of that vehicle. You get out the vehicle, you walk round and you get in the left hand side. Suddenly, you're in the same vehicle as at home, made by the same company in the same colour, and it's the same year made. Everything is identical, but the steering wheel's on the left-hand side. Well, this is like buy-to-let. When you get onto the road in Spain, driving on the left-hand side, suddenly all your senses are sharp and you're really concentrating because it feels unfamiliar, yet you are qualified to do it. Well, buy-to-let's the same. I know of advisors who have been recently still pushing personal ownership because they understand that and thinking getting the customer the cheapest rate was the right thing to do. But once that landlord filed their first annual tax return, of which a friend of mine has just done, and his tax return's going in for January, he has lost £2,300 on the buy-to-let that he's purchased, yet the rent is higher than the mortgage. And it passes all the ICR, but because he's a high rate taxpayer, he's only able to offset just 20% of the largest business expense, which is finance cost. And he wished now he hadn't focused on that monthly payment, but actually focused on the net income position after tax. So think of your mindset. Every landlord, and I'm a landlord, I need you. You're my number one important advisor. You are the one that will give me qualified mortgage advice. Your job is to search all the lenders in the marketplace and come up with the best criteria and the best rate once the structure of ownership has been decided, of which you are not qualified to give me that advice on. Never ever advise to a landlord on a purchase if no tax advisor is in a product or a purchase in one structure of ownership, because that will constitute as the advice. In other words, don't just give them rates in personal names, always give them an example in a limited company, which shows then that you've given them complete advice. Here is the cheapest rate for you in a limited company, here's the cheapest rate in personal ownership, and not get them to compare the monthly payments, because that's not a monthly payment, that is a business expense. And it's whether or not it's tax deductible is where you should draw their attention. If you're going to quote rates and monthly payments, that's the other bit of information I think you should give them. But referring them back to a tax advisor to make that decision. It's not your decision to give An accountant is as qualified as you are to give tax advice. 93% of all accountants have never passed a tax exam, so I would just assume they're not qualified. The historians, they can literally take the structure of ownership and do the tax return. What they can't do is give tax advice, whether it be bought in personal names or limited. They might be able to give you an opinion, they might be able to signpost you, but again, it's not their area of expertise. Letting agents become absolutely so invaluable now the Renters' Rights Bill is in place, and particularly the correct process of issuing whatever certification to ensure that if the unnecessary event of eviction occurs, that everything is in place. Solicitors are so important to make sure the property that the landlord is purchasing has all the right planning and licensing and that everything is in order. But as a landlord enters the UK property market for the first ever time, buying their first ever property is one individual or individuals that need to speak to a tax advisor. A tax advisor is independent and qualified and will be able to give them the advice. So let's just say your next customer is a first-time buyer, first-time landlord. The person who needs to speak to them first to make the decision of whether or not they buy in personal names or a limited company is a tax advisor. And their qualifications are easy to find online. And it's about making sure that you have one that you're aware and can refer them to. Buy-to-let very quickly becomes complex. Over the years, I've brought with me an onion to try and help you visually understand the layering that's within the complexities when it comes to buy-to-let, which is totally different to residential. There's much more things to think about because remember, this isn't a residential home, it's a business. And the primary rule of a business is to make a profit. And you need to think about those unintended consequences. I have always used the iceberg analogy right the way back from when George Osborne announced in Parliament in June 2015 the removal of interest relief on an ordinary basis down to 20% for basic rate taxpayers that ultimately came in the tax returns in January 2021. Landlords at the time had very profitable portfolios, but once that interest relief came in, those high and top rate taxpayers suddenly found themselves having profitable portfolios to unprofitable. In other words, that hit icebergs, or they knew they would be in a lot of problem in the coming years. So let's really think about the example I first explained to you. Imagine that your first customer coming in tomorrow morning, all right, let's just work on tomorrow morning, hypothetical, is a first-time buyer, first-time landlord, okay? Now, this is a real case that a friend of mine who is a really experienced mortgage advisor had experienced. She wasn't the one who actually met the first-time buyer, first-time landlord herself. She met them after the purchase. This was last year. They'd gone into a mortgage advisor saying they want to get on the property ladder. They do not want to purchase their first home they live in. So the first ever home they are purchasing is a buy-to-let. They need a buy-to-let lender that will allow them to be a first-time buyer and also a first-time landlord. And they want to purchase a buy-to-let property in personal ownership. What they then want to do is they want to purchase this property, and this property they want to be able to buy for £250,000. They've got £100,000 deposit, and they're on £62,000 a year and they're 26 years of age. So you've got a 26-year-old, 62 grand a year, wants a mortgage of 150,000. So you do the 3 times income multiple and think, yeah, this is definitely not a backdoor residential. They could buy this in their own right. What you then need to think about is they've got the 100 grand deposit. This will fly through. What the mortgage broker at the time did was to literally put in the sourcing systems of what lenders will do, first time buyer, first time landlord, and it brought a list up. Top of the list at the time was NatWest at the cheapest rate, and they went with that. They went purely based on that residential mindset. Yeah, cheapest rate, it's got to be right for the customer. Right, we'll do it that way. And the application went through and it completed. Properties rented out. But it was then that the client came back this year to my friend who is a mortgage advisor wanting to purchase a house in Reading for £600,000. And when my friend, the advisor, went through the fact find, suddenly she realised there was a huge problem. And the problem was obviously the unexpected impact, because the mortgage advisor last year had done the purchase based on the rate, they'd done it in personal ownership. What that meant was the buy-to-let flat that they purchased last year paid no stamp duty at all, none whatsoever. There is never a good outcome for buying a buy-to-let and paying no stamp duty, because what that meant when they were buying their new residential home, their first ever residential property to live in, they would then have to pay the extra 5% stamp duty because it was purchased in England. That was an extra £30,000 of stamp duty. Also, they suddenly realised when doing the tax return that because they bought that property in personal ownership and were a high rate taxpayer, they could only offset just 20% of the payment to NatWest, which therefore meant they were actually losing money as well. And when they said to the advisor who was advising them on the purchase of the residential, what can we do? They said, well, once you purchased your residential and paid your extra £30,000 in stamp duty, what you can elect to do is sell that buy-to-let and you'll get that extra stamp duty back. A, they didn't want to sell the buy-to-let, and B, they had a 5-year fixed, which meant they had ERCs to pay of 5%. None of it was good news. They then went to speak to a tax advisor who had said to them categorically, in 99% of the times, they would always advise a 26-year-old purchasing the first ever property to obviously pay in the limited company. Therefore, they would have protected their first-time buyer status. Now, I often get asked at events and online, hang on, Rog, if your first ever property is held in a limited company, it's an arm's length transaction, and therefore you would lose your first time buyer allowance. Well, that's absolutely incorrect. First time buyer landlord schedule 6ZA of FA 2003. The tax legislation which defines a first time buyer that is entitled to first time buyer relief is under schedule 6ZA of the Finance Act 2003. It clearly states that a first-time buyer is an individual who has not previously purchased an interest in a dwelling. An individual is distinct from person. A person under the tax legislation can be a company, however, an individual cannot. So what that means, a company owns the property on land reg, but the individual is just the shareholder. Therefore, their status under Schedule 6ZA of the Finance Act 2003 means that they can qualify for first-time buyer allowance if it was bought in a limited company. And obviously, they'd pay that higher rate stamp duty, but that would have been significantly less than what the situation they're in now. Unfortunately, the clients took the original advisor to the Ombudsman, and I believe the Ombudsman then ruled immediately that that advisor had given tax advice because they hadn't given them the option of a limited company, hadn't given them a written explanation of the extra stamp duty they'd be liable when they bought the first residential, and therefore had to pay that redress of £30,000 in stamp duty as a minimum. And again, everyone keeps saying, but they didn't give tax advice, but they did, is the way the Ombudsman has ruled. So just be very careful on ensuring that you understand this particular area that is becoming more prevalent with the Ombudsman when it comes to stamp duty. So it's easy to get confused, puzzled, or unsure, but by the end of these webinars, and maybe by watching them again, it will become much clearer and easier to understand. So buy-to-let has changed dramatically. Since I started to become interested in buy-to-let in the early 1990s, let's just have a look back where it all started from. I love this particular fact. The Housing Act 1988, and I am actually proud to say, I don't know if you can see on camera, but I'm going to hold up, it's a first edition of the Housing Act 1988. What this particular guide created, and it was actual Margaret Thatcher. I know it could be quite an emotive name in history of politics, but what Mrs. Thatcher did was create an assured short-hold tenancy. It's funny, that's now been replaced by an APT, an assured periodic tenancy. But what we need to do is to understand is prior to 1988, before the Housing Act came in, you would rent a property for life indefinitely, but there was no incentive for the landlord to improve the property whatsoever and to do any form of alterations or work. And therefore, the property itself were lived in squalor conditions. But a landlord then having an AST where the rents could be put up every 6 months was really powerful. And suddenly the quality of housing in the UK improved. By 1995, it was common for the word buy-to-let to be aware in mortgage circles. But by 2004, with the changes to the Housing Act, buy-to-let became quite prevalent. There was 4 types of property construction or categories, and they're pretty obvious. Number 1 was residential. Number 2 was house of multiple occupation. Number 3 was semi-commercial, and number 4 was commercial. Not rocket science, but the 2004 Housing Act had lots of legislation that would ongoingly affect things like the definition of a HMO, selective and additional licensing that we've now seen around the UK, and we'll cover these off in detail. By 2008, particularly with the advent of the American subprime banks and UK banks fueling the demand for securitisation, the buy-to-let market had reached its peak. And this is where ultimately the dinner party landlords had come from. It was just the key thing to say, apart from having a residential property, having a buy-to-let and potentially a holiday home in Spain. In 2015, the pressure on George Osborne and the then Conservative government to win favour on young voters was to increase a secondary stamp duty on second homes of an extra 3%. That's had quite a journey, not only through the devolved nations, but during COVID. In 2016, the interest relief removal down to basic rate 20% tax allowance for privately owned buy-to-let that was announced in June 2015 by Judge Osborne became law. And that's where we saw huge changes. First of all, the forming of limited companies, of which a trading business was just literally formed, had then been restricted to an SPV, specific purpose vehicle, by the denoted SIC codes. In 2017, the PRA1 and PRA2 brought in minimum underwriting standards to ensure that the current portfolio, even though it wasn't being refinanced by the new lender, would stand up to interest rate changes. Because remember, in 2017, a standard 2.99 5-year fix was the norm because we'd been in a low interest rate environment since 2007. And therefore, it was logical to expect that base rate would recover because base rate would need to be, according to the Bank of England, circa around the 3% mark. And therefore, base rates and lending and fixed rates could then move potentially to a 6%. And therefore, stress testing became a key component within this. 2018, the HMO licensing changed forever and followed Scotland's lead that came in 2000, which was a Civic Act of Scotland that really thought about the minimum living standards and what denotes a HMO. And this was all born out of fires and tragedy that happened in the 80s and the 90s. And the rules and legislation around the safety in houses of multiple occupation unfortunately came from the tragedies. And the definition of the minimum of 3 people or more comprising of more than one family unit sharing one or more facility became that HMO, and the licensing requirements came in with that. But also in the October 2018, the Minimum Energy Performance Certificate of Energy Standards, the MEES, Minimum Energy Efficiency Standards, that then became a minimum requirement of an E rating, came in at that particular time, which wasn't too onerous for the industry. What landlords like myself did was happily, on like-for-like expenditure, could replace single glazed window for double glazing, double glazed doors, being able to replace a fixed boiler for a combi boiler and putting loft insulation. All this was tax deductible expenditure, which allowed most Victorian properties easily to move to a D rating, making it viable for a landlord by making the changes tax efficient and by making the improvements to a tenant, which are a lot different to the potential proposals that we'll see future on in this timeline. Ban on tenancy fees came in 2019, beginning to affect the way that letting agencies would run, and the end of stamp duty abolition, changes to COVID and trying to re-stimulate the buy-to-let marketplace was certainly another key component, certainly a spike in completion, similar to that March 2015. Electrical testing also came in. Any buy-to-let property that is rented out on a 6-month AST at the time needed to have an electrical certificate to ensure that the property met those 5-year rules. This was a real challenge for myself and other landlords because this came in the April during that time when COVID was at its height, and having to move a family out of the property into short-term serviced or hotel accommodation at the landlord's expense and having to get electricians to come and work in the property was not easy. 2022, in the January, the interest relief had been absolutely phased out in that year's tax return, and that had its consequences that washed through, particularly as interest rates rose. The making of tax digital for landlords didn't actually come in, but it is now starting to come in from next year. And the importance of the online system actually is really advantageous to landlords to make the submission of tax returns so much easier. But the fire safety regulation for serviced accommodation also came in, and this was quite significant. What does this mean? In the October 2023, if you had put a 1-bed property on Airbnb, you could have rented that out prior to that. But now, and since this act came in, any property on Airbnb must meet the fire regulation standard for serviced accommodation. So even if you're just renting your own house out for a week, it must have fire doors throughout the property and meet the same standards as a mandatory HMO. The emergency lighting and the emergency fire alarms all fixed. The consequences of this, there's so many landlords out there doing serviced accommodation, not realising this ruling in, which comes with significant fines. More on that to come in future webinars. The changes of the minimum EPC standards to a state is still in consultation. The review of MEES is going through, of which the way we manage our minimum energy efficiency standards through our EPCs will change forever next year. And hopefully we'll understand that Victorian properties are designed to breathe, and the consequences of Airwab's law becomes from having to break up those air ventilations. Also, the Renters' Rights Bill became now in law, and the removal of the AST has gone, and the now increase or the change to an APT, Assured Periodic Tenancy. The Renters' Rights Bill overall protects families to give them the surety that they can remain in the property for a minimum of time. to try and stop bad behaviour of bad landlords that are allowing families to live in poor, damp and squalid conditions. It also will give a balance to landlords to ensure bad behaviour of tenants, and the eviction process will have to see as the courts remove Section 21 in favour of Section 8, but the complexities of eviction and the backlog in the courts can cause some real problem. So if I was giving you one tip, make sure that your landlord benefits from landlord income protection, which is an add-on from buildings insurance, which specialist insurance providers can actually offer. So that comes to the end of part one of this particular webinar. I'm going to pass you back to the studios to Natalie, who'll just close this off. Natalie.
Thanks very much, Roger. Wow, another really informative webinar there. So we'll say goodbye for now and we'll see you again back in part two. Thanks for listening.